Hello, hi everybody, and welcome to the June edition of the Azure Functions Community Stand-Up. Thanks everyone for joining either live or if you're watching this later. Hope you like the content that we have for you today. So I have with me, I'm Thiago Almeida, I'm a PM on the Azure Functions team, and I have with me Eamon O'Reilly, also a PM lead here in the Azure Functions team. We've had quite a lot of announcements recently, especially during the Microsoft Build conference last month, which I hope you also watched some of the sessions online or participated in person. And Eamon is here to give us a whirlwind tour of all the announcements and the news from both the conference and things that were announced around the same time as well. So with that, I'll leave you with Eamon to take you through all of the announcements and even show us a demo for one of them. Thank you, Eamon.
Awesome, Thiago. Hi, everyone. My name is Eamon O'Reilly, like Thiago said. And there's been so much going on in Functions over the last few months. I wanted to just spend some time kind of walking through, what we've kind of released over the last few months, as well as what we announced at Build just recently, just to give you some indication on, what are some of the bigger areas we're working on, but also hopefully to get feedback from you on what's working well for you, what improvements you'd like to see, what additional changes you'd like to see to the product as we go forward. So really happy that you decided to watch, and definitely ask some comments if you're doing it live. Otherwise, you can always ask in the channel. Okay, so the thing I'd like to start with is what we've released over the last few months in Azure Functions. When you think about Azure Functions, as most of you guys know, when you're using the service, there's three main things we try to focus on when we build out Azure Functions. The first is trying to really improve the developer productivity for building services, as well as the operational efficiency. So a lot of our effort goes into making it as easy as possible for developers to build applications, but also reduce the operational overhead when you're running them. And then the second thing we do spend a lot of time is making sure that the service scales and meets the demand of whatever kind of application you're trying to build on it. And then third is we want to make sure that when you're building functions, you have the flexibility to host it in any kind of environment you want to. So that portability and flexibility of running the functions runtime anywhere is some of those kind of three big areas that we invest in across the board. And so when you look at it from that perspective, there's a bunch of features we did. I want to kind of walk through a little bit today over the last few months, just to try to give you some indication on how we're advancing each one of those areas. And for love to get feedback from you guys on what's working well, and also where can we make improvements as we go forward. So the first thing was the Python programming model. So if you're familiar with Azure Functions, we support a lot of different languages when you're developing your event-driven architecture using functions, and one of those is Python. And we've had support for it for quite a while, but one of the things we've learned kind of working with the larger Python community is that knowledge they have of building Python applications, they want to be able to bring that forward seamlessly to building functions as well, and also get all of the kind of enhancements you have when you're building Azure Functions. So the V2 programming model was in public preview for quite a while. We got lots of great feedback from the community, from people trying it out. And we've made a lot of changes and improvements so that if you are building Python applications now in Azure Functions, there's a new programming model that really tries to make it as easy as possible for you to bring that Python knowledge over, take advantage of the programming model inside of Azure Functions, as well as all of the hosting and runtime capabilities. So if you haven't tried out that, it's in GA now, please go try out the new programming model. Love to get more feedback. And hopefully it does make your life a lot easier and more productive if you are a developer using Python. I think the other area that I wanted to call out is durable functions. So a lot of you who are kind of active community members with us as we build out the service are familiar with durable functions, and it really allows you to have state management inside of your function apps using code, and allows you to do all kind of workflow related activities. We've seen a huge amount of customers using this over the last few years, and to the extent that actually it starts to hit some limits on the performance and throughput, because we use Azure Storage as the backend, and it works for most scenarios, and customers are extremely happy with it. But because customers have been putting more and more applications onto durable functions and increasing the scale, there have been scenarios where the backend storage account we use for durable can become a bottleneck. And so one of the things we released into public preview last year, and now just recently went into general availability, is a new backend provider called Microsoft Netherite. And this gives you this allows you, using event hubs and Azure Files, to really have a lot faster throughput, but also meet kind of the performance needs you might need if you're heavily dependent on durable functions. And then the other thing that we released into general availability was Microsoft SQL support. And what this gives you is the ability for portability now of Azure Functions. So if you're running them in another environment where maybe Azure Storage or Microsoft Netherite isn't available, you can also now host and run your durable functions in that environment, like maybe a Kubernetes with SQL available, so that you can still get the same functionality. There's a few other things that the platform always provides, and that's trying to keep up to date with the latest languages that are released by the community. And then, as you know, we fully manage those for you, so you don't have to worry about installing critical updates or required changes to the underlying frameworks. And so with that work, we recently supported Python 3.10. So you can take full advantage of Python 3.10, and then also Node 18. And so one of our things is, as those new community languages come out, we want to bring it in, make it available to you as you build out your Azure Functions. The other area kind of related to language improvements and language development is making sure that the .NET isolated model works really well for all kinds of applications as we go forward. And one of the things we've been doing over the last year, if you're familiar using .NET and Azure Functions, is to try to enable customers to move to the isolated model instead of the in-process model that we default today. And one of the benefits of that is you get a lot more control when you're building out your .NET applications, but we needed to make sure that all of the different capabilities we have in functions also work really well in that .NET isolated model. And one of the things we added was durable support for the .NET isolated model as well. When you think about that other big area we invest in, which is kind of running at scale for our customers, making sure that we manage all of the back end, you don't have to worry about the infrastructure. A lot of that is related to us providing this kind of at scale, full managed service that Azure Functions is. And so with that, we wanted to make sure that if you do have a requirement on availability zones, you can use those inside of Azure Functions and get that high availability kind of DR support built into the service. And so we already had that across a bunch of regions. There's new regions available as well. And I think Thiago, in one of those first slides, has a link to the community doc where you can go and read up more about all of these improvements and the new regions supported as well. In a similar vein, thanks, Thiago. In a similar vein to that, what we've seen a lot of our customers doing, and thanks again for that kind of feedback and use case, is customers are leveraging Linux a lot more. And it's partly because, Linux is fully supported inside of Azure Functions. A lot of applications work really well with that. The open source nature of all of the community languages work on Linux. And so we've seen a lot more customers using both our consumption and our Elastic Premium to host their apps on Linux. And so what we wanted to do was make sure you could kind of get that high-end scale in Linux like you do in Windows as well. And so we've increased the scale out limits to kind of match what Windows does for a lot of the regions as well. So hopefully if you're building Linux apps and you want to get that scale, you'll have it available inside of that premium plan as well. The other area I wanted to touch on real quick was the SQL bindings for Azure Functions. So one of the things we work on, as you know, with Functions is trying to make it very easy for you to connect to these different systems so that you don't have to worry about the plumbing on how to get events from those systems, how to send data to those systems. That really is the core of the programming model we offer in Azure Functions. But a lot of that is built on the extensions and the bindings that we support. And so we keep adding additional ones based on customer feedback, on what they'd like to see. And so SQL, which is very popular service inside of Azure, very popular when you're using Azure Functions. There are bindings that went into GA for both input and output that you can use now to kind of work with SQL without having to kind of code up all of the plumbing yourself. The identity-based connection support. Again, one of the areas we focused a lot on over the last several months was trying to remove the requirement to have secrets embedded into your application to connect to any of the services that you're working with. And so most of our extensions that you use today have identity-based support for them, but there's also support now if you're trying to use the built-in storage we use for Azure Functions, so you can use identity-based connections to context storage as well. So you no longer have to have that Azure Web App Storage with secrets enabled. And a similar thing, Durable Functions also supports managed identity. I think one of the asks I would have is if you are building out applications using functions, think about using managed identity to connect to all your different systems, both the external extensions as well as the internal storage. And it really does kind of harden the security across all of your services if you can take advantage of managed identity. And then on the scaling side, there was a big enhancement we made recently, which is called target-based scaling. You can read more about it, but it really does give a lot more control to you on how you want your Azure Functions to scale, as well as how quickly you want them to scale. And so this is kind of a new algorithm and capability that we offer now to customers who want to take advantage of determining how they want to scale and how quickly they want to scale. And so this is called target-based scaling. There's a whole documentation associated with it. It's very easy to enable, but it does open up a lot of scaling capabilities to customers. And so hopefully you can try that out if you're trying to build applications and you have a certain requirement on how it scales. And then the last thing I'll just call out is the support for the .NET Upgrade Assistant. And so this is really trying to help customers in Visual Studio easily upgrade their applications. If they're on an older version of .NET, they want to move to a newer version of Functions that supports the newer versions of .NET, then there's a built-in capability that will help you to update your project files, update your solutions, update all of the different pieces to successfully move you from an older version of .NET to the kind of newest supported version. So again, kind of keep an eye on that if you are running older versions of .NET. This should help you easily migrate forward to the latest versions. Okay, so with that, I'm going to jump into the build list of enhancements that we did over the last few months. But before I get there, one of the big things we did with Azure Functions at Build was we announced a new capability to run Azure Functions for cloud native microservices. And what this really involves is allowing you to now deploy Azure Functions, not just onto all the different plans and the Kubernetes that we support today, but also run it on top of Azure Container Apps environments. And so if you are building microservices today, you have containers that are part of your larger workload, you want to take advantage of containers and the Container Apps capabilities, we now announced the ability to also deploy Azure Functions into that shared app environment with Container Apps. And this really kind of opens up a lot of scenarios and solutions when you're trying to build kind of a integrated workload that might require more than just functions in order to deliver the end-to-end scenario, but you might require integration with containers. And so this opens up that scenario. So I wanted to demo a little bit about how that works, give you a flavor of, what's the scenario around it and what are kind of the core things you have to do to get started. So with that, I'm going to kind of share out my VS Code window for a second, and then I'll switch over and share out the browser window as well as we go through it. Okay, so hopefully now you can see that I'm inside of VS Code. And let me just do a few things in here to kind of show you how to get started. So the first thing when you do, when you're creating a function app is you initialize it inside of VS Code. And so what I've done with this one is I just ran func-init, and I specified I want to use Node and I want to use JavaScript as my language. And you can see I added in the -- Docker because we're going to be working with containers because we're going to be deploying into the container app environment, but we still want to get all of the productivity and familiarity you have using functions. And so once that's initialized, what you'll see is it creates a function just like you normally would when you're creating functions, but it also has the Docker file. And so what the Docker file does is it actually pulls down our language worker for you, pulls down the latest images. You can see it's pulling down Node, and you're up and running. But beyond that, everything else looks and feels like a regular function when you're developing. So you can go and you can create new functions inside of here. You could say, I want to pick a HTTP trigger one, maybe a blob one. Any of those that you would normally build with functions, you would just build them normally, test them locally. Nothing changes from your experience as how you would normally build applications. But once you're happy with that kind of integration like you've done with functions, you then want to be able to deploy it, but not just deploy it into our existing consumption tier or app service tier or the premium plan, but now we're going to deploy it into the Azure Container Apps environment. So what that looks like when you're developing these is the first thing you'll want to do is you make changes, is you'll just build. And so if you have Docker on your machine, you can just build a new version and it'll just go ahead and build locally. So you can see it's doing all of the normal stuff associated with pulling down the images, checking them, and then now I have a new version available. And then once you have the new version available, you can then tag it the way you would normally tag a new version. So I'll just change this from 5 to 6. And so now you can see I'm going to push it to my Azure Container Registry, and I've just tagged it there. So once I've tagged it, then you'll just want to be able to push and be able to push this new version up to the container registry. So what all I've done here is basically built like I normally do. I've created an image for that Azure Function app, and now I've pushed that image up onto container registry with the version name. So very kind of familiar tooling, familiar experiences. And when you're publishing, it's just now you're going to publish an image instead of publishing the app directly. And you can use GitHub Actions for this as well, if you like, in order to kind of complete the end-to-end scenario. So once you have the image up there, then all you have to do then is create a new function app, just like you would normally create a function app, but instead you're going to reference this image that you want to host for your function app. And so there's different commands for that one, but you can see here I can create a new or update an existing function app with the actual container. So if you can see, I'm just using the standard, what's the resource group, what's the function app, all of that is available to you, but I could just change to say, oh, I want to use that new version that I just created. And that'll actually go either create a function app or update a function app with this latest version and have you run it. So all of these kind of commands are just the normal function app commands you would have, but instead of kind of working with the app content, you now are working with an image that you've pushed up to the Azure Container Registry. So once all that's done, I'm going to kind of walk you into the portal and see what it looks after the fact. So I'm going to share out a new screen and hopefully be able to do that. Okay, I'm just bringing up my screens here. Okay, and then I just added the stream. Hopefully you can see it now. Thiago, is that showing up okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so after you've deployed your function app, what does it look like inside of the portal? So one of the things we really wanted to focus on was in making sure that that knowledge you have of building function apps carries forward no matter what kind of environment you're running it on. So you can run it on our existing ones, but in this case, I'm actually running it on the container apps environment. So the first thing you'll notice is it looks like a function app. So it'll show up as a function app. You'll use it just like that. The capabilities exist over here. So I can kind of go into the functions and start looking for functions that might be available. I can go into my application insights and start to get the monitoring that I might want to use. So all of the capabilities you would expect are available inside of the portal because it's using the same underlying capability. It's just running in a different environment. And how you know you're running in a different environment is mostly because you'll see if you go to the overview that you can see it's now running on an app environment. And so what this app environment means now, instead of running on like a premium plan or an app service plan, you can actually go into the container app environment and you'll see that all of the different app types that you want to run are now hosted in this shared environment. And if I go into apps inside of this container apps environment, you can see I have a bunch of these that I just created. So I have like, a bunch of these community apps that I just created, but there's also container apps inside of here, and you can have Spring apps as well. And so what this allows you to do is basically have lots of different apps that are running in the shared environment, and they're all going to communicate seamlessly with each other because they're all running under a shared network. And so all of the networking, if you set it on this app environment, it applies to all the different apps that might be running in there. So it really simplifies your life when you're trying to have these application types talk to each other. And so that's one of the big benefits of moving kind of to this microservices world. The other benefit you get from having them all shared in this container app environment is you'll get common logging. And so all of the logging will actually go into a common log analytics workspace. And so all these app types, the different function apps, the container apps, even if you have Spring apps, all of those logs get sent to a common place. So it does allow you to kind of have that unified query, unified capability to get the right monitoring and logging available. So that's kind of how the process works from that perspective. Other than that, there's not really any other major differences. There will be more capabilities coming out. So here you can see it got deployed. So I have two triggers in here. I have a HTTP trigger. I have a blob trigger. And so they work very similarly to how you would expect them to inside of functions. You can go in, look at the function. You can see how many executions it might have. You can go click on code and test and see the code associated with it. So all of that backend capability is built in to the function app. And so are all the scaling rules. So as you can see, I didn't really change any of the scaling rules when I deployed the blob or deployed the HTTP function. All of that is done for you automatically on the backend, and we'll configure Kata correctly to do all of the scaling. So just like a normal function app, you can get the URL for it. You can go hit that URL and you'll get the same functionality you would normally get. So that's kind of how the experience looks inside the portal. Our main goal with this was just to make it very easy for you to build function apps, deploy them onto container apps, and then have this integrated environment that allows you to run everything together. And you'll get application insights, you'll get all the normal stuff you would expect, and there'll be more of these features coming out between the public preview that just launched and then the GA later this year. So hopefully this allows you to try it out, and I'd love to get feedback as we go forward. Okay, so let me go back and share back the slides. Here we go. Okay, so for the public preview, the big one I just showed was the Azure Functions for Cloud Native Services. So that hopefully gave you a feel of what that looks like as you go forward and you want to try it out yourself. Love to get feedback on this during the public preview. But there were a whole set of other capabilities we launched as well during the release. So the first was the Azure Functions v4 programming model. So I talked a lot about the Python experience and how we make it a lot easier if you're a Python developer to build on functions. But we also released a public preview of Node. And what this allows you to do is to take advantage of all of your JavaScript or TypeScript functionality, but there's an enhanced capability now when you're building those experiences locally that make it a lot more friendly for you as a node developer to build Azure Functions inside of the experience. So we'd love for you to try out the new programming model, see all the different enhancements we made there, but also give us feedback to make sure we kind of meet your expectations as a node developer going forward before we bring it into general availability, similar like we did with Python. Another feature that we released during before build was what we call SDK type bindings. And what SDK type bindings do is they allow you to not only pass in the content when you get a trigger today. So typically when you get a trigger from a blob or a service bus or some other external source, we serialize that content and then we hand it into the language worker so you can just easily work with it inside your function. So you don't have to write any code to get that content from the trigger. You just focus on your business logic. But it is serialized content, so you don't get a rich SDK object that you can work with. But what we've introduced into public preview now is for a set of these triggers, you can look at the blog and see which ones are supported. We not only can give you the serialized content, but also now give you the rich SDK object as well. And so you can imagine if you're working with blobs, and these blobs are large, typically we'd have to try to serialize them. You might hit some limits on that serialization. It might be slower. Whereas now, because it's a rich object, you can just stream these directly in and use that inside of your code as if you're working with an object directly tied, because you are, to that event source. And so a lot of that full functionality you get from the SDK is now available for you inside of your application code as well. And so initially we're starting in the .NET language worker for out-of-proc when it's running isolated, but this does open us up to add these rich SDK objects into all of the other languages in the future as well. And so if you're kind of interested in running in the isolated version of .NET, which we hope you are, definitely please try out this. I think it opens up a whole new set of scenarios for you to make things easier depending on what kind of work you're trying to do with the trigger data. The last couple I'll mention is if you're also a .NET developer, we added ASP.NET Core integration in running in the .NET isolated model. So you can see a lot of these new enhancements we're making are going into the .NET isolated model because it allows us a lot more flexibility to add new features, but it also isolates you from the underlying host when you're building .NET applications going forward. So if you are an ASP.NET developer, you want to bring that knowledge over and use that framework inside of functions, you can do that now inside the .NET isolated model. And then the last couple I'll mention is that whole investment we're making to make it very easy for you to connect into external systems, that's available now. So Azure Data Explorer, so if you're used to writing Cousteau and you want to get triggers based on that data, you can do that now using the Azure Data Explorer bindings. And similarly for Azure Cache, you can do a very similar thing now with Azure Cache for Redis. You can get that trigger and get that event automatically sent to your function app by just using these built-in bindings that just went to public preview. Okay, so that's kind of the whole review of what we did for GA, what we did for build. There's so much going on, as you can imagine, inside of the service. Hopefully you guys get a chance to use the things that make sense for you when you're building applications. We'd love feedback on any of these areas, even the ones we've gone GA, the public preview of all of these features. We'd love to get your engagement. Let us know what's working, what we can improve on, as well as any other areas that you'd love to give us feedback on. We're kind of constantly looking to engage with the community. They've really helped us out over the last few years building out Azure Functions. We'd love for you guys to continue to kind of make the service as good as possible when you're building these apps. So with that, I'll hand back to Thiago and see if there's any questions, or else we'll finish up the stream. And we'd love for you to kind of go on the link, learn more about all these releases, and let us know, how things are going.
All right, thank you, Eamon, so much. I really like the demo, especially showing how we can have one environment in the container app environment and hosting different types of microservices in there and container apps inside the same environment. So it's really looking forward to what our customers and everyone that's joining the live stream think about that, and how they consider in the future, if they're already building solutions with container apps and they like the portability of the functions runtime, the developer tools that we bring, but then targeting to join the same environment in container apps. That looks great. And I've been showing the link at the bottom here. That's a short URL for a post that we have on the Apps on Azure blog with all the links and going deeper into each one of the items that Eamon called out. But with that, that's all the content we had for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Connect with us on Twitter or in the blog post. You can also leave comments there if you have any follow-up questions on any of the items that Eamon has talked about today. Otherwise, we'll see you in a month for the July edition of the live stream. Thanks, Eamon. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Thiago. Thanks, guys.
Bye.